having me. Let me share my screen. Really excited to talk to you all today. Okay, that looks good? Okay. So yes, my name is Erin Cord. Nice to meet you all down in Austin, not too far away from Temple. Let me see. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you first a little bit kind of Bats 101, and then I'll talk about some of the species you guys have in your area. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about ways you can help bats in your very own yard, which is always my favorite part. But I think a lot of times when people think of bats, they are potentially afraid of them or maybe don't understand them. And this is just kind of an example of a lot of different like movie posters and cartoons and just ways bats are portrayed or have been portrayed kind of in pop culture as scary or kind of just something to be worried about. And I think a lot of that comes from just not understanding them and also the fact that they are nocturnal. So people don't really encounter them in their daily lives usually, unless they find about on the ground, which is something I'll talk about in a second. But I think because of these public perception, there's a lot of myths out there about bats. And we usually talk about kind of 5 main bat myths, and you've probably heard some of these. You may have said them at some point, that's okay. But the first is that bats are blind. This idea of being blind as a bat, you've heard that expression. Obviously, it's not true. Bats can see about as well as you or I, but they also can echolocate, which is using sound to find their food in the dark, which is kind of amazing, kind of like a superpower. So they can see and kind of do that as well. Another myth I've heard, which I don't quite understand where it came from, but this idea that bats want to nest in your hair or want to get in your hair. Not true. Bats do not nest in hair. They tend to roost in caves and other structures like that. But they can actually detect something as small as a human hair when they're echolocating. So obviously they can miss your head and they will not dive bomb you or get tangled in your hair, anything like that. Another thing I've heard a lot is that bats are rats with wings or rodents with wings. Bats are actually, they're not rodents. They're in their own order their own family called Chiroptera, or order, yes. And rodents are kind of their own thing too, but bats are actually more closely related to horses than rodents, believe it or not. Bats also reproduce really slowly. They usually only have 1 to 2 pups per year, and they also live a very long time. The longest lived recorded bat was 42 years old, which is crazy. I don't think that's a super common number, but they can live for a long time, much, much longer than rodents. And as we know, rodents reproduce really, really quickly. So they're very different in that way. Another thing is that all bats are vampire bats, or the bats are going to suck your blood. They're going to attack you. For that, I say there's over 1,400 species of bats in the world that we know of. That number's going up all the time as we learn more. And only 3 of those are vampire bats. And actually only 1 of those 3 specializes and feeds on the blood of mammals. All of them are found in Latin and South America. None of them are found in the United States. So yeah, only 3 out of 1,400 plus species of bats are actually vampire bats. They're not really that common, honestly. And then another thing that people think a lot is that all bats have rabies, or bats are more likely to have rabies than other species. This isn't true either. I think this is more of a kind of issue where when people do encounter bats sometimes during the day, if it's a bat on the ground, it may very well be a sick bat. And with that, you want to use the common sense you would use for dealing with any kind of wildlife, where you want to wear gloves, tell your kids not to pick up wildlife, things like that. Bats are not more likely to have rabies than any other species of mammal. They can get it just like, your dog can get it, a raccoon can get it, a skunk can have it. And actually, most of the rabies bites in the United States are actually dog bites. So, bats kind of get a bad rap, but these are kind of the myths that you can dispel now and tell all your friends. So I did want to talk really quickly about COVID-19 because we get lots of questions about bats and COVID. Scientists don't yet know the origin of COVID-19. They suspect it's potentially a bat, but we are not sure about that yet. So, one thing we do know is you cannot get COVID from a bat. You can only get it from a person, as we know too. And I think, bats, the benefits of bats are really important and something we should be talking about even more. And kind of the issue with these zoonotic viruses jumping to people, because of there's so much habitat loss and destruction now on a grander and grander scale. As we move into more and more wildlife spaces, these virus kind of jumps are probably going to be more likely. So we should protect bats, we should protect their habitat, and they can potentially teach us a lot about, vaccines and dealing with viruses, because their immune systems are really, really amazing too. So yeah, in conclusion, we don't yet know if COVID came from bats, no matter what people say. And you can't catch COVID from a bat. And the bats that they think are associated with COVID are bats in the genus Rhinolophus, which is the horseshoe bats, which are found in Asia, and none of our bats in the United States are associated with the disease. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but I guess I'll wait till the end. So yeah, as I said, there's over 1,400 species of bats in the world, which is amazing. That's so much diversity within the bat world. Unfortunately, many of these species are imperiled or at risk. This number here says 18 to 31% of the species in the US are at risk, and I think it's probably closer to 31% of those, maybe more. There's a lot of threats that bats are dealing with that I'll talk about more in a second, but internationally, the IUCN here kind of has these different categories or how they list different species, and quite a few bats are either critically endangered as a species, or vulnerable, and then many bats are data deficient, which means we just don't know enough about them to understand if they're in trouble or not. So, that's something that's really difficult because, we might be losing species that we don't even know about. So it's really important to study these bats, to understand these bats, because they are a really important role in our ecosystem. And so, as I said, bats are more closely related to horses, but also more closely related to humans than rodents too, which is crazy, except when you look at this picture. So this is our arm and hand bones, and you can see that the same bones are found in a bat wing. So a bat wing is actually just the bat fingers, and it's kind of like they're flying with jazz hands, we always say. Kids love doing that. But they are actually from the order Chiroptera, which is Latin for hand wing. And this just gives you a better idea of it. So they've got their little thumb up here, that little piece, and then all their fingers are what creates their wings, which is a really interesting adaptation that they've got to fly. But it's a very appropriate name, hand wing, Chiroptera. And then, as I said, they echolocate, which is really amazing. They actually scream as loud as they can. Lucky for us, the screams are high pitched, and they are outside of our frequency of hearing, which is fantastic because, if you went outside at night and you could actually hear bats, the Congress Avenue Bridge would be crazy loud. It would just be bats screaming and screaming and screaming. But we can't hear their screams. The sound actually bounces off an insect or something, the food that they're going for, and can navigate towards that food by continuing to get that feedback from the sound. And actually, so they don't deafen themselves when they're echolocating, because if you were screaming all the time, you could actually do some damage to your hearing. When they're calling out for echolocation, they actually detach one of their ear bones temporarily, and then it reattaches when they're kind of done. So they kind of just do that. So that's how they actually prevent deafening themselves when they're echolocating. So it's a really cool thing. So I've got a video here. Hopefully you guys can all see it. So in this video, you're going to see a bat, and then as it comes in, you're not going to be able to hear it, but it senses the spider in this web here and changes course and then goes for that spider. So hopefully this works. Here comes the bat. Oh, it's like, oh, what's that? What's that? What's that? It's screaming and woo! It grabs it. I'll play that one more time because it's super cool. There we go. But yeah, this bat, as you can see, when it grabs the spider, it grabs it with its back legs and then scoops it up with its tail. And that's how bats grab insects on the wing. So that is a very unhappy spider and a very happy bat. Okay. And then with this, I don't know if you guys can hear the sound. Probably not. But this is just another video. So there's a moth there. And the bat comes up and grabs it. And I'll play it again. So you see the moth. And then the bat will come up, scoop it with its tail, catching it on the wing, which is very cool. All right, so why are bats important? Why should we care about their conservation? Well, pretty much all the bats in the United States are insectivorous, which means they eat insects. We do have some nectar-feeding bats in Texas and Arizona and kind of some of the southern parts of the West. But most of our bats are insect-eating bats, and they are extremely important for pest control. They eat a ton of bugs that we consider pests, crop pests, garden pests, things like that. And they've estimated they save farmers about $23 billion annually because they are eating the bugs that they would otherwise have to spray pesticide and herbicides on. So actually, they make our food cleaner because farmers don't have to use as many chemicals, and they're saving the farm industry a lot of money by their just normal feeding. Like the bats at Bracken Cave and the bats in Congress Avenue, you'll notice when they go out at night, they actually go east, and as they're going toward the ag fields, kind of in the more eastern part of the state. So yeah, bats are very important for pest control. And as everyone always says, they eat mosquitoes, so everyone loves them for that. Bats are also really important pollinators. They pollinate a lot of different plants, and they're very efficient pollinators because they're so large. They carry very large loads of pollen. So when they visit flowers, they're very effective pollinators. And then this is a very important equation. They are the sole pollinators of the agave plant, which makes tequila. So if you have agave plus bat pollinators, you will have tequila. So next time you have a margarita, you can thank the bats for that. And there's actually bat-friendly tequila you can buy. If you're interested, there's a website called the Tequila Interchange Project, and I can put that in the chat or something after, but you actually can buy bat-friendly tequila where the farmers, when they make the tequila, they tend to harvest the plant before it flowers because the plant has more sugar, and then that's better for the agave, for the tequila making. But the farmers that do the bat-friendly tequila actually let some of the plants flower, which is good for the nectar-feeding bats. So bat-friendly tequila is a thing. And then I wanted to show you this video. So this is a bat in a lab, and you can try to imagine the bats coming up to a flower, but you can see how the nectar-feeding bats use their tongues to slurp up nectar. So just imagine this is a flower. This is the nectar at the bottom of the flower. Then we've got our nectar-feeding bat come up, checking it out. So, I'm sorry, this takes a minute, but he'll stick out his tongue once here. And he realizes he's not in quite far enough. So this is great. If you're a flower, he's getting covered with pollen. And then he sticks his tongue up and just slurps up that nectar just like a straw. So they have really long tongues, which is very cool. Okay. And so bats pollinate about 500 different species of plants, so much, much more than agave. Many of these plants are economically extremely important, ecologically very important. And they also pollinate a lot of the wild types of our favorite fruits and vegetables. So the wild types are great because farmers will incorporate them into the stock that they're growing. Like bananas, for example, if they include the wild types as well, it increases the genetic diversity of the banana crop and therefore makes it more resilient. So a lot of the things that we eat every day have bats to thank for them. And then bats are really important seed dispersers too. This is one that I think is kind of exciting to talk about and maybe people don't realize, but you have your fruit-eating bats, which we don't have here, but they have lots in South America and Africa and Asia. But the fruit-eating bats obviously eat the fruit and then they leave the seeds behind in their guano. Well, if you have an area that's been clear-cut, like in the rainforest here, a lot of wildlife is not going to cross this area because it's open and they feel vulnerable, but bats will fly across. And as they fly, they may leave some guano, and those guano have seeds in them. So about 95% of the pioneer plants, the kind of first plants to appear in a clear-cut area, are sowed by bats. So bats are really, really important for forest regeneration, especially in our rainforest, which is really important. And then bats are facing a lot of threats, unfortunately, and I could do a whole webinar on each one of these, but I will try to keep this short. I'm sure many of you have heard of white nose syndrome. That's probably the main threat that they're facing right now. But these are all of them are very important. But white nose is a disease that was brought in. We're not exactly sure from where. It is found in Europe and Asia and bats there, but it does not cause those bats the problems that we are having with our bats. But it was brought in at some point in 2006, probably by accident, in New York. And this graph will kind of show you, this is the first occurrence of white nose, and then each year is represented by a different color, and you could see it spreading farther and farther and farther out until it is definitely in Texas now, and some parts of the western United States too. It mainly impacts bats that hibernate because they get a fungus that grows on their wings and on their nose. That's why you'll have this classic white nose look, which is where it gets its name. But the fungus causes lesions on their skin and their wings, and it makes them very uncomfortable, causes them to wake up when they're hibernating. And so each time they wake up, they're using energy, and they use too much energy and they keep waking up, and then they end up starving to death. So it's killed extremely large numbers of bats. I mean, we have a number from 2012, which we really need to get an updated number, but it was over 6 million bats have died, and then it's quite a lot more since then. It's really impacted certain bats, especially the hibernating bats. The little brown bat has just been devastated by this, our tricolored bat also. So certain bats have really, really suffered huge losses from white nose, and it's a really big threat to a lot of our bats. And I can talk about more about that if you guys have questions, but wind energy is another one. And I know, we all love renewable energy. I absolutely think it's amazing, but for some reason, we're not exactly sure why exactly, but there are a lot of bat fatalities at wind turbines. They estimate about 100,000 bat fatalities per year in the United States from wind turbines. And the bats, they seem to be potentially attracted to the turbines, and they're still kind of figuring out why that is, and they're working on ways to deter them. But this mainly impacts our bats that are migrating long distances, like this hoary bat here in this picture. So these long distant migratory bats tend to kind of run into these wind turbines on their migratory routes, and it causes a lot of fatalities. And so we're working with a lot of wind companies to try to mitigate this and try to understand it and try to prevent more, because I think, wind energy is booming. It's going to keep growing, and we have a lot of wind energy in Texas. So, the faster we kind of figure this out and hopefully prevent these bat fatalities, the better. Climate change obviously is kind of a big issue everywhere for every species, and we're still really understanding how it impacts bats. But we do know it means less consistent food sources, potentially less access to water, habitat loss, habitat encroachment by invasives, extreme weather events. The freeze that we just had killed quite a few bats. So yeah, and then in Australia, they've had issues with extreme heat killing hundreds and thousands of flying foxes. So climate change is massive and kind of all-encompassing, and it's something that we're still really trying to understand. And then habitat loss comes in many different forms, but for a lot of bats, this is a major issue, whether it be loss of roosting habitats with caves, or loss of foraging habitat with development. Habitat loss across the board is bad for all wildlife. Okay, so now our bats. I say we have 33 species of bats because even though I said we don't have vampire bats here, someone found a mummified vampire bat after a hurricane way in South Texas once. So that bat makes it on our species list, but it's never been seen again. So 33 species, but it's actually more like 32. Now, I was just going to talk about a few of them that you guys might, have heard of or encountered that are found in your area. The first is this eastern red bat, this beautiful orangey. This is a beautiful male. The males are like these beautiful lion bats with these orange manes. These guys are found pretty much all over the eastern United States, as you can see by their range map there. They are migratory, so they have been pretty heavily impacted by wind turbines, unfortunately, but they are solitary roosters. So people often think of bats, they think of these giant colonies, like we have a lot of them here in Central Texas especially. But these bats are solitary. They roost pretty much alone, or a mom will roost with her babies. These guys can actually have up to 5 young, which is kind of insane for a bat. That's so many. But they roost in trees. So if you have trees in your yard, you probably have had bats in them and didn't even know about it because they're all by themselves and they're very quiet. And these guys will actually curl up to look like a dead leaf. So they have really, really good camouflage. So that is the eastern red bat. There's the northern yellow bat. And I wanted to talk about these guys because they roost in dead palm fronds. So if you have a palm tree, and I don't know, all the palm trees here look terrible after the winter event. So I'm not sure if they're still alive, but if you guys have alive palm trees, if you can leave them shaggy, so I know a lot of people will cut the dead palm fronds off, but if you let them hang, that's actually where these northern yellow bats will roost. And they're generally solitary or groups of 2 or 3, and they will hang out in those palm fronds. So that's something you can encourage your friends and neighbors to do too, is to just leave their palm trees a little shaggier, and it's great for the northern yellow bat. The hoary bat is one of my favorites. They are really big bats. They're really long migratory flyers. They're kind of found all over the place, but they're definitely experiencing a decline in numbers, mainly due to wind turbines, unfortunately. But they're called hoary bats because they have this kind of silver look to the tips of their fur, and it resembles hoarfrost, which is what this stuff is, which I actually think we were able to see about 2 weeks ago here for the first time ever. We had hoarfrost in Texas, but these guys are powerful flyers. They nest solitarily or roost solitarily in trees, but they are very cool migratory species. And every time I hear one in a bat detector, I get really, really excited because they're not as common. Then the evening bat is another one that's pretty common where you guys are, and very, very common in the DFW area. These guys will occupy bat houses, as well as the Mexican freetails. They're kind of the main bat house occupants, but these guys will also do it. And they actually have really large guano, which is one way you can kind of tell an evening bat from a freetail if you're just looking at the poop. But the evening bats, they also like to nest in dead trees too, and they're kind of found around the southeastern United States, but very, very common in this part of Texas. And then the big brown bat is probably the most common bat generally in the United States, besides the Mexican freetail, which does generally stick to like the southern part of the US, but they are experiencing range expansion. The big brown bat is one of the few hibernating bats that hasn't been hugely impacted by white nose, and they're still trying to figure that out. It may be because they have a larger body size. It may be because they hibernate in a little bit of a different temperature range than other bats, but these guys are actually doing okay, and they're pretty common, and they will occupy bat houses, but they're more common in bat houses kind of on the eastern side of the US, whereas here we'll either have the freetails or the evening bats. And then the cave Myotis is, unfortunately, as I said, white nose is now in Texas, and we had our first bat death related to white nose recorded last February, and it was a cave Myotis. So these guys are hibernating here, which makes them vulnerable to white nose, whereas our freetails don't hibernate, they migrate or they just hang out. So white nose isn't going to impact them. They can carry the fungus, but it's not going to kill them off probably. So unfortunately, the cave Myotis is very vulnerable to white nose, and Texas Parks and Wildlife is heavily monitoring their populations and just trying to get a handle on where white nose is and which populations are affected. But these guys are, very common in our caves, and we have a lot of caves, especially in Central Texas with all of our karst habitat, and they're very commonly found there. And also commonly found is our tricolored bat, which they're very, very tiny little guys. Formerly, they were called Eastern pipistrelles, PIP for short, which I think is a really fitting name. Now they're referred to as tricolored bats because it's hard to tell in this picture, but if you were to pluck kind of one of their hairs, the hairs actually have 3 different colors on them. It's like dark brown, light brown, medium brown. So that's the tricolor. But these guys have been very severely impacted by white nose as well as wind energy too, unfortunately. So these guys actually may get listed as endangered species not too far down the road, but they're very common in our caves here. And they actually sometimes, if you see them in a cave, they will have dew kind of all around them because generally where they hibernate or hang out, it's more humid. And it actually looks like they have this beautiful sparkly coat on, which is really cool. These guys are very, very cute and tiny. And then I can't leave off, must talk about our Texas bat, the Mexican freetail. They're actually from the genus Tadarida, which is like wrinkly lips. So I don't know if you've ever seen one this up close, but they do have wrinkly lips. These guys are so common here. They have these giant maternity colonies that you'll see mainly in the summer. At Bracken Cave, there's over 20 million bats during the summer. So these are the ones you see in Austin under the bridge. It sounds like you guys have some under your bridges, which is very cool. And then this is Bracken Cave, which is the property that BCI manages. It's a little bit north of San Antonio, and you can visit. You have to join BCI to visit, or you can get to know Fran, the preserve manager, and he might invite you. But yeah, Bracken is amazing. They all come out in this like bat tornado shape right around dusk, and it's really just the most amazing experience. And if you guys have seen your bats emerge or the ones in Austin, there's also a couple of other bat roosts around Texas that are pretty well known, and they're all Mexican freetails. Sometimes you'll have cave Myotises that hang out with them, but freetails are the most common bat in Texas for sure. And they tons of ag pests here, so they're really, really important. They're also clocked as the fastest bat that we know of. They clock them at about 90 miles per hour, I believe, because they actually will forage really, really high up in the air. And so kind of using gravity, come down to chase stuff. They can go really, really fast. They're very, very powerful flyers, which is cool. So yeah, freetails are wonderful. So yeah, these colonies, again, they're maternity colonies. So they're mothers and pups. And then the males will have kind of smaller fraternity colonies that they just kind of hang out on their own under smaller roosts in the summer too. So what can you do to help bats? This is a question I get a lot, and it's hard because you can't, with birds, you can put out a bird feeder or build a bird house, and usually those are fairly successful, and it's kind of an immediate, you can see the birds using the bird feeder, but bats are a little bit trickier. One thing you can do is put up a bat house. You want to make sure you get the right kind. There's a lot of bad bat houses out there, and generally they're just really small, and you want the biggest bat house you can get. Honestly, we recommend a 3 to 4 chambered bat house at the minimum, because the issues with bat houses are they're either, they can be really cold or really hot, and they don't kind of regulate the temperature very well. So the larger you are, the better chance you have at kind of different temperatures within where the bats can kind of move about and find what they need. And you want to, if you can, you want to, sorry, I thought I was on a different slide. You want to avoid the ones that have mesh inside or kind of wire or anything like that. Some of them will have that. That can break down, and then we've seen bats actually get tangled in that, which obviously is very bad. People have asked about bat attractants. People are selling lots of those, whether it's like pheromone spray or smearing guano on a bat house. None of those things work. So don't buy them ever. It's just people trying to take your money. And then you're supposed to paint them the right color. And there's a lot of information on our website, batcon.org, if you're interested more about bat houses. But you need to paint them the right color. And since we're in a relatively hot area, you want to try them a lighter shade so they don't absorb as much heat. And then to install it, against a building is best, again, because it kind of holds those temperatures more steadily. You can also put it on a post too if you don't have a building, but don't put it on a tree. We do not recommend that because of predators. They need about 6 hours of direct sun a day, and we usually recommend kind of that morning sun because the afternoon sun is very hot. So usually facing them east or south is the best bet. And then you want them about 20 to 30 feet from the nearest tree, again, to just help them avoid predators and to give bats a chance because, we've seen kind of hawks or other things hang out if they're really close by and they can just grab the bats as they fly out. So the farther away they are from a tree, the better chance they have of actually kind of getting going and getting away. And then you need them pretty far off the ground, 12 to 20 feet, so the bats can actually swoop out and swoop in. If you have a near water source, that's great. You're much more likely to have bats in your bat house. But above all, we always say that bat houses they require patience because sometimes it takes years for the bats to discover your bat house and to occupy it, so it's a fun thing to do, but you just have to kind of, just know that it might take some time. And sometimes you'll have it up for many years and no bats. So then we recommend trying a different spot. So there's a lot of nuance to it and people get really frustrated, but it is really cool once you have bats in your bat house. It's a really exciting thing. But there's other things besides bat houses you can absolutely do in your yard. As I said, if you have trees, leave the trees, which I feel like I don't have to tell this group. I'm sure you guys are all happily loving your trees in your yard. But because there's so many different kinds of bats and they live in different places, trees are really important for bats for roosting, but also trees are really important to attract all the bugs that they eat too. So obviously trees are wonderful. Dead trees too. If you have dead trees and you can leave them up or snags and it's not a safety hazard, a lot of bats will roost under the bark of dead trees, like this brown bat here or the evening bats that I talked about earlier. And then leaving your palm trees scruffy. So if you can leave this, fantastic. That's great. And then with any gardening for wildlife, we always say kind of having these vertical layers where you have different things at each layer of canopy. That'll provide so many different insect habitat and food for the bats, as well as kind of roosting habitat for them too. So vertical layers are always a good idea. And it's a nice way to kind of have different plants in maybe a relatively small space and think about it as different layers of habitat, really. And then other yard tips, these are probably very intuitive, but we always say them anyway. Don't use herbicides or pesticides because you're killing the bat food. And I know that's tough sometimes because certain plants are really aggressive or, you have something that's eating all the food in your garden. So we just say, use your best judgment and try to keep it as organic as you can. Keep your cat indoors. Obviously, they eat a lot of birds, but if you have a cat outdoors at night, they can definitely eat bats, and we have seen that. We actually have there's a cave in Jamaica that we are working on protecting where the feral cats are such an issue with the bats there that they actually had to build a cat fence around the cave because the cats would just hang out there at night when the bats would roost and just grab them out of the air. So cats will definitely eat bats. So you want to keep your cat indoors. It's good for your cat. It's good for the wildlife. And then also keep your yard as dark as you can. Because the cities have so many lights, it can be very distracting to the bats. It can actually interfere with them echolocating effectively. So the darker your yard, the better, and the more likely you are to have a bat-friendly habitat. And then people often ask, how do I provide water for bats? Will they use my bird bath? The answer is no. So basically, bats need about 7 to 10 feet of water to really be able to drink from it because they swoop in and drink on the wing. So if you have kind of a larger pond or a water trough, that's great. We always say to make sure you put one of those wildlife escape ladders in anything. If you have a pool, bats will actually drink from pools, but only in kind of the really hot summer times. And I'm not really sure that pool water is obviously very good for them, but it's always good to have a wildlife escape ramp on any water trough or pool or kind of any body of water they maybe would fall in and couldn't get out. But they're not going to come to your bird bath. So, if you're going to have water for bats, it might take a little bit more work or planning for that, but you can do it, absolutely. And you'll notice kind of if you do have a water source and bats will become aware of it, the first thing they usually do when they come out after roosting, come out to feed at night, is go get a drink of water. So you may be able to see them at sunset visiting your water, taking a drink, and it's a really exciting experience. And then we're actually working on a gardening for bats program, which is really exciting, and I can't wait to kind of roll it out. But this is basically what we're talking about. You've heard probably of gardening for wildlife, and bats are just one more species of wildlife that you can kind of tailor your yard to. And with this, since most of our bats are insectivorous, we're recommending plants that attract the bugs that they like to eat. So it's kind of providing like a bug buffet for the bats. So we talked about different things that are really fragrant, things that have fruit. They attract a lot of different kinds of bugs, but then things that bloom at night, like this Jimson weed here, it's pollinated by sphinx moths that come out right when the bats are coming out to feed. So that's perfect for them. So things that kind of bloom later in the day or at night are wonderful, kind of providing food sources for bats. Lighter color flowers attract moths too. Host plants are obviously fantastic, and you can get lists of host plants online. And also the pests that attack your garden, so the things that eat your kale and your lettuce and your squash, all those things, bats love those moths, and they will eat lots and lots of them. So, if you have a kale plant that you're willing to kind of give over to the insects, that would be great for the bats. But obviously you don't have to do that. And then this idea of bloom time succession, which is where you just want to have something blooming as often as you can throughout the year. And obviously it's harder during certain times of the year to have something blooming, but we're pretty lucky. Generally, our climate is pretty mild, and you kind of can have something blooming for most of the months of the year, and that's good. It gives the bugs a food source, which gives the bats a food source. And the last thing is, hopefully all of you will leave this meeting and be really excited about bats and want to tell all your friends and neighbors about how cool bats are and all the wonderful things that they do. So just having more people out there being bat advocates, talking about bats, conveying to people how important they are is wonderful. And it sounds like you guys have a colony near you, which is really cool. And I don't know if groups are out there kind of talking to people about the bats when they come out, but that's a fun master naturalist thing to do for sure. And there's just a lot of opportunities. I think especially now, with COVID, bats are kind of getting a bad rap. And I think more than ever, we need to stand up for them and talk about them and acknowledge that their conservation is extremely important and connected to the conservation of our planet. So with that, I'll get off my soapbox, and I am happy to take any questions you guys have. And please feel free to email me too. This is my email address.
Well, thank you, Erin. That was a lot of information coming in. Bats are such a great topic for master naturalists because of all the different roles they play and a lot of mystery about them, and often aren't seen, or if they are, they're like the photo behind you where they're just up in the sky.
Yeah.
But couple of questions. One is back on the white nose syndrome. Is there any treatments or prevention strategies that anyone has come up with yet?
Great question. People have tried a lot of different things. There's studies being done where they're working on trying to figure out if they can inoculate the bats. Obviously, the logistics of that are really complicated and pretty, they disturb the bats a lot when they're doing it. But one thing that actually BCI scientists are working on, I think I talked to Jean about this, is our Fat Bat project, which is we had our scientists look at the bats that actually were surviving with white nose. For example, we were looking at little brown bats, and some of them were surviving with white nose, and we we're trying to figure out why. And she found that the bats that were surviving were fatter, had more body fat on them. So it seems like, if they have extra fat reserves, it can potentially allow them to live through kind of the waking up issues associated with white nose and actually not starve to death. So we have this project where